These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Anatolia is a giant rectangle, where modern Turkey sits today. At the very center of that rectangle was once the core of the mighty Hittite Empire, its power now long since shattered. Just a bit to the west of that Hittite core sits the land which, ever since the Iron Age began, is known as Phrygia. Today we're using archaeology to tell the story of how the Phrygians arrived in Anatolia, how they lived, adapted, and dominated, and how they rose to prominence under the legendary King Midas before the destruction of their land by the Cimmerian raiders. There is a great mystery surrounding the Phrygian people. Though they could write, and may have been literate as early as Bronze Age collapse times, they had the sort of alphabetic script derived ultimately from the Phoenicians that tends to get written on perishable materials like leather, parchment, and wood, and only very rarely inscribed upon stone and clay. More on their language later, but in part because of the lack of surviving writings, and in part by accident of geography, very few people have chosen to specialize in Phrygian archaeology specifically, leaving them chronically understudied. Most often, the Phrygians get studied by people who are specialists in their neighbors, so they get viewed through a Greek, Assyrian, Hittite sometimes, or rarely a biblicist lens. And because of all this, I would say most histories do a poor job of explaining their origins, and the state of this research in general has a lot of work left to do. However, the fact that there are unanswered questions about the Phrygian entry and settlement into Anatolia doesn't mean that all hypotheses are equally likely. They spoke a Balkan language, related to other known Balkan languages, and indeed it is close enough to Thracian, Macedonian, and Greek that the language was roughly readable to early experts even before they had fully worked out what was going on. Kind of like someone who knows Spanish encountering Portuguese writing for the first time. They share some burial practices with the Balkan natives. They helped introduce Balkan-style cavalry into Anatolia. They brought in a tradition of fine wool working, which points to a Balkan origin, and they have material culture similarities with Balkan societies circa 1000 BCE. These facts are not consistent with them being Hyperboreans, Proto-Indo-Europeans, Atlanteans, aliens, or a lost tribe of Israel. These facts are consistent with them being a Balkan tribe of the late Bronze Age that crossed the Dardanelles during the Bronze Age collapse. The mysteries here are in the range of where in the Balkans did they originate? How big a proportion of the Balkan influx into Anatolia were they? When and how did they enter Anatolia during the collapse period? What's their relationship with the Mushki? These are genuine questions that don't even seem to be the subject of active debate due to the sheer lack of evidence. Everyone just sort of agrees we don't really know until we find more stuff. This is what historians usually mean when they talk about mysteries and open questions within a field. We might be looking for a needle in a haystack with some of these questions, but we can often set bounds for how large the haystack itself is, and politely suggest that those digging through a large cow pie on the opposite side of the field from said haystack, while we can't prove the needle certainly isn't there without getting our own hands dirty, we can spend our time rummaging carefully, strand by strand, through the haystack. Anyway, having just told you that there's a lot we don't know for sure, there is a general theory that seems reasonable. Sometime between 1300 and 1100 BCE, something happened up in the Balkans. It could have been climate shifts, could have been activity from the steppe peoples, generally called the Scythians, but That's not so much the designator of a single people, but like a Greek classification for all the horse peoples in the general area that they encountered. But these steppe folk could have been a lot more active and displaced the Balkan peoples. But we see a lot of movement in the region just in general. Some of the sea peoples might have come out of there. We've got the Doric entry into Greece, and some of the other theorized entrants into Anatolia all move right around this time, either sparking or contributing to the Bronze Age collapse. There is, at the very least, an interesting Trojan War connection to note here. Homer claims that the Phrygians were participants in the Great War on the Trojan side. But it has long been noted that the lists of participants in the Iliad better represents the early Iron Age political landscape than it does the late Bronze Age, so I don't think that this is terribly credible. However, there has been Balkan pottery found at the Ilium archaeological excavation dated to about 1180 BCE, which does quite neatly line up with our conventional 1200 BCE entry date alongside the Bronze Age collapse for Balkan peoples into Anatolia. Whatever the cause, we can be sure that right around 1200, some or all of these entrants into Anatolia from the Balkans began overwhelming the weakened Hittite Empire, ultimately causing it to collapse alongside pressure from Kaskan raiders. To a certain extent, the invaders completely displaced natives, causing them to either flee or perish, but in other areas the natives stayed under the dominion of their new overlords, and Anatolia, already a patchwork of different peoples and governing styles, becomes an even more complex picture, varying widely from place to place. But what we can say for today is that the area of central Anatolia, near and a bit west of modern-day Ankara, the region just west of the old Hittite heartland, becomes the home of a Balkan people that we come to know as the Phrygians. In this early period, they're probably not a single unified kingdom, though it is possible that there was some sort of leader over the various clans who made that initial journey. Also, there is reason to think that the Phrygians came through in multiple waves, with an initial wave chiefly of warriors and a second wave of settlers into the now established Phrygian chieftains. They begin in Anatolia much the same way they lived in the Balkans, living principally off their sheep, and quite early on they were recognized by their neighbors as expert producers of woolen textiles, and that soon became their most prestigious export. They did well enough that their society grew larger and more complex, taking up indigenous patterns of farming and coming together collectively to mine metals for use and trade. As had been the case in the Bronze Age, a diversified crop mix, supplemented by silver and copper mining, became the foundation for a number of Phrygian towns in the first few centuries. Those who claim that they know what the Phrygians were doing in those first few centuries are usually just projecting the later, more well-understood Phrygians back on those initial settlers, which we know is at least somewhat misleading. After all, one of the most impressive things about Phrygian construction is their blend of the stone and mud brick constructions common to Anatolia with the wood beam supports they had brought from the Balkans to build rather more impressive and enduring fortifications than were common in the rest of Anatolia. Some even judge Phrygian fortifications to be a step up from the late Bronze Age Hittite ones, thanks to their new styles and their blending of materials. No doubt this becomes integral to their success at some point, but we don't see these large, impressive fortifications at the start of the Phrygian archaeological record, because of course you usually need to be settled in to a degree before you can start investing that kind of effort into your cities. Though, now that I say that, examples of recent entrance into an area or semi-nomadic peoples constructing monumental structures are popping into my head, and we're actually gonna maybe kind of see one next episode, but for sure it is probably a general rule that people who just show up to a place don't start building giant super fortresses. Additionally, one of the most famous aspects of Phrygian culture, their tumuli burial mounds, is entirely absent in the first few centuries, leading some to wonder just how different were the initial wave from the later waves of settlement. Now, of course, I say famous, and most of you roll your eyes. Archaeologists are always obsessed with burial sites and burial practices because, of course, grave robbing is a source of extremely valuable and often intact information. But in the Phrygian case, it seems the tumuli burials really did become famous, not just archaeologically famous, as we see other Anatolian cultures adopting them in later centuries, and they even become something of a fashion among Persians of the Persian Empire, at least at a certain point. They're basically just large mounds under which bodies and a bit of treasure are buried for the afterlife, but they seem to have really caught on in the wider region. But because so little is known about the early periods, we have very little narrative to offer for this era. From 1200 to perhaps around 900, the Phrygians arrived, settled, and adjusted to their new region. We don't know if they had any degree of political unity. Even at this early date, the city of Gordion does stand out, which will later be their capital, but we have no idea if it started as the capital or most important city, or if it was sort of a loose culture where each valley and town had its own leader. There is also the city we now call Midas City, with its ancient name unknown, and then there are the later Greek towns of Kotyaion and Dorylion, two more towns whose Phrygian names seem to be unknown. Then there seem to have been possibly dozens of smaller settlements all throughout that general region of west-central Anatolia. None of these settlements lived in isolation, not from each other and not from the outside world. The dynamic and complex tapestry of collapse-era Anatolia was a place of change and constant intercommunication. On the west coast, the archaic Greeks were founding the colonies that would become the great Greek city-states of the Anatolian coastline. They interacted regularly with the people of Lydia on the northwest coast and the people of Lycia on the southwest coast, each of whom were the descendants of the native Lucan and Arzawa region peoples, though dramatically changed by the centuries of collapse, intermixing and adapting to a new world. To the east, the Hittite heartland seems to have been held by a very poorly understood post-Hittite remnant. One would assume that they are Hurrians and maybe even Hattians still, the people groups who dominated that area in the late Bronze Age, but curiously I see relatively little discussion of Hurrians and Hattians in the literature, and even Trevor Bryce's quite impressive book on the post-Hittite world skips discussion of this region completely. Hopefully we can get some ancient aliens theories to fill in the gaps here, but for now all we can say is that the area is either understudied, or it could just be basically a wasteland in this area. To the southeast we start to hit the Neo-Hittite states, starting with Tabal, the large Luwian kingdom of the Kilikkian Mountains, and then there's also a big question mark in the form of the Mushki peoples. In the older historical work, Mushki was taken as a synonym of Phrygia, because in Assyrian records we never hear about Phrygians, only the Mushki. But in Greek and the single Neo-Hittite record that we have, we never hear of the Mushki, only Phrygians. Now, however, there seems to be an increased suggestion that the Mushki were a people group who lived around the same place as the Phrygians, but ultimately became subsumed by them. Though whether these were Anatolian natives, sort of like the Kaskans, or another intrusive raiding group is unclear, as is pretty much any details about the Mushki in particular as a people separate from the Phrygians. And so they're basically two names for the same people in the historical sources, even if that does obscure some pretty interesting social and cultural dynamics that were probably going on in central Anatolia. Interestingly, there seem to be strong connections between neighbors and a lot of exchange going on in the region. For a long time, there's been a theory that Phrygia might have been some sort of bridge culture for transmitting Hittite, Syrian, and Mesopotamian culture over to the Greeks. Which, to be honest, is a very Greek-centric way of looking at it. And it's probably worth a bit of a tangent as well, now that we're getting into what's more commonly known as the Greek Archaic Age, and the amount of study and effort that's gone into Greek studies absolutely dwarfs basically all the rest of humanity in this era. Only China even gets close now that they're starting their spring and autumn period. And so more and more scholarship of this era is going to have a heavy Greek focus, which often skews people's understanding of the late Mesopotamian empires, as well as, of course, the Persian Empire. Before you ask, we won't be covering Greek history on this podcast. I find only one person in all of Greek history to be worth the fuss, and that is Philip II of Macedonia, and everyone else is overrated. Greece will probably get occasional mentions, but is not going to be our focus. Anyway, there's an idea that Phrygia was sort of a bridge connecting the East and the West, but there's a lot of skepticism around the idea at the same time. You have two fundamental questions. The question of if and when the Greeks got Hittite myths into their legendarium, though that's increasingly likely to have happened during the Bronze Age, not the Iron Age. And then there is the question of alphabets. You see, both Greek and the Phrygians have related languages that each use variations of the Phoenician written alphabet. Their respective variations are clearly related to each other, so it seems unlikely that both simply adopted the Phoenician alphabet independently. But the question of whether Phrygia borrowed from the Greeks borrowed from Phrygia, or if there's a missing link after the Phoenicians that both borrowed from, is the subject of active debate. And the stakes here, aside from just linguistic dick measuring, is the scale and direction of trade in the collapse period and early Iron Age, and that actually does matter. If we look just at material culture, which largely means pottery shards, it looks kind of like trade across the Anatolian peninsula was extremely restricted and localized. On the west side, Phrygia trades with Lydia and Lycia, Greeks trade with Lydia and Lycia, but Greeks and Phrygians don't directly trade. Similarly, Phrygia trades with Kybele, the nearest Neo-Hittite kingdom, but doesn't seem to directly reach out much past that. A situation like this suggests that long-range, land-based trade was nearly impossible from around 1200 to at least 800 or 900 BCE through Anatolia, and likely points to almost apocalyptic levels of raiders and bandits roaming the countryside, making the odds of long-distance trade too remote to regularly attempt. In this vision, the Phoenicians and Greeks aren't necessarily colonizing all over the Mediterranean just because they feel like it, but because there may have been no other feasible options for long-distance trade. On the other hand, if we have cultural ideas like alphabets and stories traveling relatively freely during the collapsed centuries, all the way from Mesopotamia to potentially even northern Italy, as some suggest there are even Etruscan ties here, then there's a way to explain that via boat, but ancient archaeologists tend to largely discount the scale and capability of ancient sea voyages, so it would suggest that there was quite a lot of peaceable trade occurring over land, necessarily passing through Phrygia. Now, I am a bit of an ancient sailor optimist, so perhaps long-range spreading of ideas can somewhat be explained by Phoenician sailors. But the whole debate is basically a question mark. And because YouTube is telling me to encourage more engagement via easy-to-answer questions that raise people's passions, please drop a comment down below about whether or not you favor terrestrial or maritime routes for cultural transmission during the collapse period. Yes, like and share. All your friends are very interested in this. Anyway, that is at least the debate. But what it seems to me is going on with the Phrygian economy is that it was a backwater. Phrygia seems to me to have been carved out by military leaders from the Balkans, who then took over the timber, metals, and wool industries of central Anatolia, using these to drive profits for themselves to equip and grow the armies that they needed to drive off constant external threats and to establish themselves as territorial rulers a century or so before the rest of Anatolia was able to really settle down. Being relatively stable and decently productive, but off the main trade routes, and with trade largely shut off in the region in general, they were forced to make their profits by trading with their direct neighbors, who in turn passed on all that stuff for a profit to the Greeks, the Syrians, the Phoenician traders. This benefited Phrygia because it fostered the development of Lydia, Lycia, and Kybele as more stable, wealthy regions. And particularly the trade with the Lydian lowlands seems to have supplemented the relatively weaker agriculture of the Phrygian highlands. But of course, this also benefited the Phrygian neighbor states themselves in the whole getting richer thing. Do I have a ton of evidence for that picture? Not really, but it does seem to fit my reading of things, and it makes for a good story, and it kind of seems to plug in to people's understanding of how the Greeks were interacting with the Lydians and Lycians, and how the Neo-Hittite states were developing in the shadow of Kybele. Anyway, economics aside, there are two particularly distinct cultural features of the Phrygians that mark them out. Being master wool workers, their clothing was regarded as particularly high quality. They tended to wear shirt and trousers, a fashion inherited from the Balkan region. Their shoes were probably long, narrow, and pointed at the end, possibly with a curled loop-de-loop at the tip of the toe, which seems preposterously ornate to me, but of course I live in a society that considers neckties or bow ties essential to formal wear, despite their total lack of practical function. Most famous in the decoration department would be the Phrygian cap. Imagine those sorts of pointy hats that we depict gnomes as wearing, probably brightly colored and conical, kind of like an upside-down ice cream cone on their head, or maybe envision sort of like a beanie, but much taller, with like a bunch of excess fabric in the middle that just goes up. Because these are woolen, or perhaps just because they were designed like this, the tips of these cones tends to droop just a bit. As a hat, it was a fashion, just like the fashions of many other places. The Phrygian cap would become a symbol, however, of foreignness in the Greek world, then become associated with freed slaves in the Roman world, and then get adopted by the French as symbols of liberty for a time, making them far more famous in the modern era than probably any other aspect of Phrygian culture. But in 900 BCE, it was just a hat. It kept the ears warm. Perhaps more significant was their distinctive religious cult, the worship of the mother goddess Kybele. I've heard some suggest that Kybele worship was adopted by the Phrygians when they arrived in Anatolia, with others saying that they might have brought her in. But whatever the origin, they took to Kybele quite strongly, and indeed we know of no other god for central Anatolia at this time. That doesn't mean they were monotheistic, but it could indicate a degree of henotheism of the sort that we're seeing to emerge at the same time with the supremacy of Marduk, Ashur, and Yahweh developing in other Middle Eastern cultures at the same time. Kybele worship was not performed in temples or in caves, as we see with pretty much all other regional gods, but in open-air ceremonies. At least some ceremonial sites had the rocks nearby carved into the mother goddess shape, with other ritual decorations and altars placed outdoors as well. But of course, being outdoors, very little of these places survive to give us much detail. No narratives survive for Kybele in the Phrygian period, but the figure of the Divine Mother was apparently so strong that it impacted both Greek and Roman cultic practice, though the Greek and Roman versions of the goddess show so much development that it's very hard to say how much of it the Phrygians would have recognized. It does seem that something about Kybele worship or the associated cult was a big part of changing the Phrygian burial practices. Early in Phrygian history in Anatolia, there were no surviving burials, and most assume that they practiced the sort of cremation that was common among Balkan societies. However, the tumulus grave style, a massive hill in which elites were entombed with their treasures, became more popular, and we also at the same time start to see an increased number of surviving Kybele worship sites. The connection is a bit tenuous, but it's not implausible. It could just also be that the culture is becoming wealthier, therefore wealthy enough to afford both more ritual sites and more fancy burial hills. Thanks in part to the accounts of Kybele worship and also from tumulus graves, we can say that the Phrygians accompanied their worship and funerals with music. Cymbals, drums, tambourines, double pipes, and lyres are all in evidence. And the drilling on those flutes, the double pipes, suggests that they were tuned to a pentatonic scale. The Greeks even named one of their musical modes the Phrygian mode, indicating at least that they did have a distinct musical tradition, even if I'm not inclined to trust the Greeks to ever get anything right about their eastern neighbors. Also, a treasure from grave digging at the tumulus called Im, the largest yet found and typically identified as the father or grandfather of the great King Midas based on its dating and splendor, there are the remains of a funerary banquet within the ceremonial vessels found within the tomb. Modern archaeologists have examined the unwashed smears of food from these dirty dishes that were buried along with the corpse to suggest that his final celebration saw barbecued goat or lamb as the main course, marinated in honey, wine, and olive oil, with a side dish of spicy lentils, garnished by perhaps fennel or some similar related plant. At least 450 liters of beverage was served based on the size of the drink cauldrons. Now, I know that my wife wouldn't approve of me just burying the dirty dishes rather than cleaning them, especially not at a funeral, but it is neat what archaeologists can work out when they have enough access to trash and filth. This certainly doesn't represent what the average Phrygian ate on a day-to-day basis, but it is a lot of fun to think about. Anyway, we've been discussing the Phrygians, just sort of marching into the region and taking over without really mentioning how they did it. And for the most part, there's a lot of uncertainty about the details of Phrygian organization, governance, and history. However, one thing we can say is that their entry into the region is, indirectly, the influence of steppe culture. The key battlefield advantage of the Phrygians by the time we actually start to see them fighting recorded battles, which admittedly is a few centuries after their initial entry, is their skill with ambush cavalry. We don't know where they picked this up. Certainly we remember that the Hittites grew powerful in the same basic region with ambush chariotry as one of their key skills, but Phrygian cavalry seems to be remarkable for their ability to strike and move. One possibility is that they picked up these basic cavalry skills back in the Balkans from the Eurasian steppe peoples, whose range sort of capped out right about where the Phrygians would have been coming from. Then they adapted those horse skills for the unique terrain of Anatolia. If this is the case, they would have been one of the earliest skilled adopters of cavalry in the region, giving them an edge in regional fighting. Their infantry, similarly, appears to have focused on mobility and skirmishing, and were apparently not nearly as remarkable as their cavalry. This could explain why they were able to fight and assert themselves as dominant within the central Anatolian region, but never really did much in the way of taking and holding an expansive territorial state. Or perhaps the multipolar nature of Anatolia might have kept them from getting too greedy, the same way we've seen at certain points in history European small powers aligning against anyone who got too large and aggressive. Still, it gives us a picture of a people who entered into the region on the strength of their early cavalry, securing a foothold in a chaotic region. From that first step, they were perhaps able to harvest timber, metals, and wood from a position of relative stability as their neighbors struggled. Over time, they were able to bring the rest of the Phrygian population over to Anatolia from their Balkan homeland, and this increased population was able to trade for food from their lowland neighbors, giving the Phrygians the time and surpluses needed to develop a caste of expert craftsmen. By the way, some of the finest Iron Age woodworking still survives in museums after having been dug up from sealed tombs around Gordion, and their talent with metalworking and textiles was also well regarded. At some point in all this, a state arises, centered around Gordion, that consolidates this culture into a single kingdom, a kingdom which grows more and more powerful with each passing decade. Powerful, mind you, in a way that really seems to lift their neighbors. We do have records of at least one battle with a Luwian king to the south, and some amounts of fighting against the post-Hittite remnants in the Hittian heartland, but at least Lycia, Lydia, and Kybele are all made more wealthy in precisely the period that Phrygia was in its ascendancy. Almost certainly they all did fight against each other at some point, but overall things seem to have been decently peaceful in the region, or at least the civilized sections of the region. And that gets us to the late 700s BCE, right as Assyria is getting its act together with the reforms of Tiglath-Pileser, who we'll hear about a few episodes from now. A fellow known to us only as Mita, who is almost universally accepted to be the fabulously wealthy and powerful King Midas of Greek legend, played a notable role in Assyrian records. We'll see the details of that when we get to the relevant campaigns in the 730s and the 710s, but Mita is definitely a power player in the Anatolian region, poised to become a threat to Assyria on par with Urartu. And had the two managed to grow and unite, the later Neo-Assyrian period would have looked quite different indeed. However, in the year 696 BCE, the Cimmerians attacked. How much damage they did is debatable. Older sources claim that they burned Gordion to the ground, though newer sources suggest that perhaps the Gordian destruction layer is misdated. Whatever the case, Midas survives for a few more decades, but the power of the Phrygian kingdom stumbles. Perhaps a strong leader could have rebuilt things, but during this lull, the neighboring peoples, Assyria in the east, and especially Lydia in the west, grow to dominate much of the region, and Phrygia is never really able to keep up. I would suggest that perhaps their military style was good in its niche, but unable to compete with the more experienced steppe nomads of the Cimmerians, nor against the professional and logistically deep Assyrians, while at the same time Greek-style heavy infantry were playing a larger and larger role in the west. It won't just be a failure of military technology, but the combination of circumstances that saw Phrygia lose its preeminence. But certainly after about 700, it fell from being dominant to being just another player in Anatolian politics, until its final integration into the First Persian Empire as a semi-independent region a little bit, and then its ultimate conquest by Alexander. There is, of course, more that could be said about the Phrygians, but the truth is that, as I said at the start, the early period is very poorly understood, even as that is probably the most interesting part of Phrygian history. And even though I did just brush off later Phrygian history with nothing but a rambly paragraph, there is a lot more that could be said about that later culture, far more than is known of the earlier culture. Still, I won't be the one to say it. I leave it for someone else's History of Anatolia podcast whenever that comes around for us. Next time we move east to a long-promised episode where we're finally going to focus our attention properly on Urartu, the mountain kingdom that opposed the expansionist Assyrians better than probably anyone else. So join us next time as we witness the peaks and valleys of Urartian fortunes, and possibly also learn a bit about their society along the way. Thank you for listening.